Welcome to the Collaborative Library micro interview series where we explore what's working and also what's not in the world of academic research and what we might need to change. I'm your host, Anya Harrison, and today's episode begins with a rather striking statement. We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. And that quote comes from today's guest, Professor Munáfo, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Provost at the University of Bath, and someone who's been thinking quite deeply about the state of research culture, what drives it, and also what might need to shift. So, Marcus, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And yeah, let's dive straight in, shall we? So that quote, obviously, less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. I think that is really resonating with a lot of people. And for those of you who haven't read your recent article in the British Psychological Society website, can you perhaps unpack what you meant by that in very simple terms?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's not my quote. It was a quote by the statistician Doug Altman back in the 1990s. So people were saying that over 30 years ago. And it resonated then and it resonates today. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, why does it still resonate today when someone said that 30 years ago? Obviously, less has changed than we might have liked. I guess what it boils down to is the fact that we need to make sure that what we do is valuable. And the challenge is that academics find everything interesting. It's in the nature of being an academic that you find everything interesting. So you think that your research question, your study, whatever it might be, is important because you personally find it interesting. And unfortunately, just because I would find something interesting doesn't mean that it's actually of wider interest, doesn't mean that it's useful to the wider world. So we need to challenge ourselves a little bit to think, what should we really be doing that is going to advance knowledge, benefit society, be useful in some way, rather than just be of personal interest. Now, there's a tension there, because one of the most precious things about academia is the ability to pursue knowledge in ways that we think could potentially lead to something valuable further down the line. That kind of curiosity-led research is exactly what distinguishes academia from research and development in other sectors. But we need to get the balance right. And I'm not sure that we've got that balance right. And actually, we as academics suffer as a result because we end up being overloaded, because we try to write too many papers, we have too many peer review requests, there are too many journals. And I think we're getting to the point where we're feeling swamped by the sheer amount of research that's happening, much of which, arguably, doesn't add that much to the sum of human knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're tapping into something quite important there. I think one point that was also featured in the article that really stood out to me was the idea that some research continues long before, sort of after the field has stopped being really fruitful. So I guess what keeps these sort of like zombie literatures going, and even after the evidence clearly points to a dead end, and also kind of what would it take, and this links with what you've just said, for the researcher community to better be saying, we're done here, we could move on?
So I think there are two different versions of that. One is when there's an important question and we have the answer to that question and we don't need to continue to answer that question because we know what the answer is. To give one example, I used to edit a journal, Nicotine and Tobacco Research, and we would get articles that reported studies that were perfectly well done, large epidemiological studies that had been done to a reasonably high standard, that reported a correlation between smoking and lung cancer or smoking and heart disease. We already know that smoking not only is associated with those outcomes, but causes those outcomes. So what does another study replicating that finding actually add to the sum of human knowledge? I'm a big fan of replication. We need replication, but only to a point. When we actually can be confident that we know what the answer is, I'm not sure that the peer review time, the journal pages, and all the rest of it that are required to generate that output are actually worth it. So that's one kind of study that we can stop doing because we know the answer. There's another kind, which is where the answer is, actually, there's nothing going on here. We are interested in a potential phenomenon for theoretical reasons or for whatever else, and we do lots of research, and however much research we do, there is no link between X and Y, there is no effect of X on Y, and that just is the answer. And that's a little bit more tricky because we can always then come up with reasons why, well, if you'd looked in this subpopulation or you'd taken this moderator into account, maybe there would be this thing that we expect to be there. So we can always give ourselves reasons to dig further into something rather than just admit, actually, this is a blind alley, we should just retrace our steps and head off somewhere else. And that's well-intentioned. You often find, and there was a blog post by Dorothy Bishop that captured exactly this dynamic. You often find, in some cases, early career researchers who have gone into an area thinking there must be something here. And when they present their null results, and it's great that people present their null results, well-meaning colleagues in the audience say, oh, well, have you thought about this or that? Can we rescue it in some way so that we do discover something? And I think that's because we're really motivated to find things, and finding out that something isn't the case is a bit disappointing by comparison. And we want to give people hope that actually they could potentially discover something in their data if they just look at it this way or that way. But I don't think that's always in people's best interest, certainly not in science's best interest, because if actually the answer is there is nothing going on here, that's important to know, and we can put our time, our effort, our resources into something that will ultimately prove more fruitful. So there are those two different kinds of needing to stop doing something. They're slightly different, and I think the second one is harder to deal with.
So you also discussed the role of statistical power, the challenge of underpowered studies. It's a very technical but crucial point, but can you explain this to us in very non-technical terms, and also how big of a problem it actually is, and what institutions or journals perhaps even can do to better design what we're doing?
Well, most quantitative disciplines that use numbers to arrive at conclusions and to draw inferences from require statistics to separate out signal from noise effectively, because we're dealing with inherently noisy data, particularly in biomedical research, in the life sciences. Biological behavioral data tends to be quite noisy. And in that context, all other things being equal, the more data you have, the larger your sample size, the more precise your answer will be to whatever question it is that you're asking. And so larger studies are more likely to give you the right answer. There's a trade-off, of course. If studies are too large, then they become very expensive, and you want to optimize your study to be best able to answer the question that you have whilst remaining good value for money. And that's particularly important if you want to be sure that the answer to your question is no. In other words, you want to get the right answer to your question, whether or not the answer is yes, there is a phenomenon here, or no, there is not a phenomenon here. And the latter is harder to answer within our typical statistical frameworks. But you can do it by defining what size of effect would be so small that actually, even if it were real, we wouldn't be interested in it. And then if what you observe is outside of that range, if you like, then you can say, well, there might be an effect going on here, but it's so small that actually it's not likely to be of theoretical or biological or clinical significance. So we can basically draw a line under this. And that kind of way of designing a study would help with that issue that I just talked about, to allow people to say with a certain degree of confidence, actually, there's probably nothing worth exploring further here, which is hard to do for human reasons, if you like, but at least we would have the evidence to support that conclusion. The problem is that typically we don't do that because we are incentivized by promotion criteria and also just a belief that we need to produce lots of papers to conduct as many studies as possible, which means that we tend to divide up our resources to allow us to run lots of studies that are individually perhaps a bit too small, rather than a smaller number of more authoritative, definitive studies that would be better able to give us the right answer to our question. And that's what it boils down to. We need to be asking important questions that we need to know the answer to, and we need to be designing our studies so that they can actually answer those questions as definitively as any single study ever can.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. This boils down to, well, quality over quantity at the end of the day, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if you ever heard the term salami slicing, but that is certainly something that happens a lot of the time. I can say from the point of view of, well, having worked in research for a long time. I think a big part of your message is that academics also play quite an active role in all of this, right? So we can't necessarily just blame the system, because obviously we kind of are the system, right? So yet many researchers especially perhaps those in early career stages, feel like they're really stuck, as you say, like they're guided by promotion criteria. If you haven't got that many publications, you can't really go anywhere. So what do? You salami slice. But I guess, what would you say to someone who's just starting out, who wants to do really high quality, socially relevant research, but also kind of is in this hamster wheel and feels the pressure to publish?
Well, I think your first point, that we are the system, is a really important one that we don't always spend enough time thinking about. So when we say that our grant was rejected by this funder, or our paper was rejected by this journal, actually the people making the decision were the peer reviewers, the people sat around the funding panel, other academics. We do all of this to ourselves. And the same is true of this belief that we need to be hyper productive to be successful in publishing 10 papers a year or whatever it is. Obviously, it's very different across different fields. But I'm not sure we actually do, because the promotion frameworks that we are talking about have been evolving over time and now focus, I think, much more on quantity over quality for the most part. Funders, I think, are much more interested in quantity over quality over quantity. Exercises like the Research Excellence Framework that we have in the UK similarly focus on quality over quantity, but somehow we still have this belief that at the end of the day we just need to have long, heavy CVs, and that's what will generate a successful career. And the problem, of course, is that that creates enormous workload for individuals and the downstream workload associated with all of the peer reviewing that needs to happen and so on. So it ends up becoming quite damaging, ultimately, that focus on hyper productivity. And I think most academics individually would much prefer to focus on quality over quantity, but feel locked into this, as you say, this kind of hamster wheel, this treadmill. And I think the advice I would give, and it's easy for me to say this, I recognize that because I've obviously made it through to the other side. My advice would be just step off the treadmill, because in fact, if you have a small number of really high quality outputs that definitively answer questions that are important theoretically or clinically or societally, people will recognize that. You will have, in the context of the UK's Research Excellence Framework, a 4-star output, and that is really valuable, being able to demonstrate that. And also, if you are generating work that is of high quality, it's more likely to have downstream impact. Not every study research leads to a direct societal impact, but you can show that it's actually moved the needle in terms of your discipline or the wider context within which that work is situated. And I think the onus is on people in senior positions, whether they be PhD supervisors or PIs or heads of department or whatever it might be, to, within the area that they're responsible for, create that culture that celebrates quality over quantity and provides the backing, the resources for those early career researchers to succeed. Because I have known plenty of early career researchers who have followed that route of really focusing on quality and also transparency and sharing all of their study materials and workflows and so on. I've seen them do really well by following that path and working in a way that's more sustainable, and that ultimately you will look back on and I think be more proud of. So certainly when I look back on my research career, I'm not proud of the sheer number of publications that I published. If anything, I probably published too many because I was on that treadmill as well at some point. It's a handful of studies of findings where you think that was really interesting, or we really found something unexpected that was worth finding out, or we did something that has the potential to benefit society in due course. Those are the things you remember. And most people will only have a handful of those because that's in the nature of science. Most of the stuff we do doesn't work out as we expect it to. But focus on that and you'll have a much more rewarding career, I think.
Yeah, it really seems to be a bit of an urban myth that has to die, right? This thing that we need to really keep going and produce and produce. But another thing that came to mind when you were just speaking there is, like, I don't know if you've read the book How Big Things Get Done, and I forget the name of the author, unfortunately, but it's wonderfully resonating and mirroring what you were saying there, that basically it's the whole idea is around this sort of like careful crafting of the product before you throw it out, rather than quick and hastily. And that obviously then leads to big things that can have big impact getting done in a lot better, basically, in a nutshell. But I think so it's quite clear now that I think your call is not just let's have fewer papers, but what you are saying actually is have more meaningful ones. So let me ask you this, because we all have this. I have certainly have one. When you look back over your career, what are the studies or findings that you feel really mattered, and what made them stand out to you?
I think there are different ways in which a study can matter. You know, one of those, and it's really important, and goes back to that sort of precious aspect of academia that we don't want to lose sight of. Some studies I just really enjoyed because they were intellectually stimulating and involved me working with colleagues that I really enjoyed working with, or working in ways that really stretched me intellectually or brought new methods to bear in an area where those methods hadn't been used before. So there are examples like that. So, for example, I did some work many years ago using a model of anxiety induction where you give people air to breathe that's been enriched for carbon dioxide. It elicits an anxiety response. It was developed to test novel anti-anxiety drugs before you take them into clinical trials. And we started using that to understand the effects of anxiety on cognition and performance. It was a very different application of that method and generated a whole program of work that was really interesting. And took me into domains that I never would have anticipated going into. So, for example, we worked with a number of sports teams across a range of different sports who are interested in the potential of anxiety induction as a training tool. And I got to do some cool stuff, basically. So that's one thing. And I think that was a really useful, meaningful application of that method in a very different context. Then there were some of the studies that made large sections of our community take notice of something that I felt needed to be taken notice of. So you talked about studies being underpowered, studies being too small to give the right answer to your research question. In 2013, then PhD student of mine, Kate Button, published a paper was on the average statistical power of studies in neuroscience, showing that most studies are just too small to give a robust answer to the question that they're trying to answer. And that was quite a high profile paper that lots of people have cited, paid attention to, used, and that was taken notice of by funders and others as part of these wider conversations around how we can improve the quality of research that we did. So that was a sort of fairly authoritative study that really kind of moved the needle in terms of policies at funders and things like that. And then a third type is one that you think could actually have some impact in the real world. So we did a study just a couple of years ago where we randomized pubs and bars in Bristol to serve alcohol-free beer on draft or not in an ABBA experimental design. And that was quite cool because when you're randomizing whole pubs to do things differently or not, that's quite challenging. And so we had to build really strong relationships with those different pubs and bars just to be able to do that study. And the results were really clear cut that when you do that, you increase sales of alcohol-free beer and reduce sales of alcoholic beer. And if that was introduced into the real world, that would probably have quite important public health benefits. It's not quite at that stage of translation yet, but the foundation is there. So that's another type of study where you think that the research that you've done might actually have real world impact. And all of those different studies that I look back on and feel proud of in some way are important, but they're important in quite different ways.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. It's very cool stuff. I have one last final question, which is a bit freestyle, I guess. But if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing only about how we currently do research and how it's evaluated, what would it be?
In a word, journals. And not to do away with journals, but to be clearer about the functions that are currently served by journals and where those functions should sit. So at the moment, journals do lots of things. They hold the version of record and they lay down these kind of nuggets of knowledge in the archaeological record of scholarship. But they also provide us with a filtering function, a quality control function through peer review, which we know is at the very least imperfect. And they also provide us with a kind of search function so we can find stuff. And sometimes they provide an exegesis function in terms of providing a summary at the beginning or an editorial or whatever it might be. So those are very different things. And actually, I don't think they all belong in journals. I think we should move from a version of record to a recorded version where the research process and all its constituent parts is held on either an institutional or, even better still, a national repository that can be updated in a much more agile way, rather than using retractions and corrections, which are pretty blunt instruments that we use for journal publications at the moment. And I think the quality control should move away from peer review and should be embedded within institutional systems themselves, so that the institutions have quality control checks embedded in the research process, and that could be part of what's evaluated in exercises like the Research Excellence Framework. So the version of record becomes the record of versions and is held in an institution which is responsible for assuring the wider world that what is there is of high quality through its own internal quality control processes, and there could be some external peer review there as well. Then what do journals do? Well, journals provide us with the search function. They go out and say, actually, there's this really interesting work that's been published at Bath or Bristol or wherever it might be, and provides a summary of that, provides perhaps some professional review of the strengths and weaknesses, brings in external commentaries, and that's a really valuable function. Journals would continue because I think both individual academics and institutions would pay for that service, because we need to have some way of filtering everything that's out there and understanding the relevance of that work in the wider context. So we don't do away with journals, we just become clearer about which functions should sit within institutions and which functions should sit within journals.
Yeah, that's very insightful. I think this is something that is becoming a lot more popular as an opinion. I think at the moment I talk to a lot of the open education sort of crowd, and they're all going on about like institution-based sort of repositories that are getting then, and I also really like the idea of open peer review in that way, so everything can be visible and transparent, because ultimately it all boils down to transparency to then advance the next steps as well. And then, but I mean, Marcus, thank you so much for your time and all these insights. I think it's definitely got me thinking, and I think many of us will probably walk away from today's episode reflecting on our own role in shaping what research is and also what it could be. And thank you all for listening as well and watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Please consider subscribing to the Collaborative Library page or sharing this episode if you found it particularly interesting, and definitely let's keep the discussion going. After all, sometimes the most important step forward is choosing not to take another one, or well, just for the sake of it, I guess. So thank you so much, and until next time.